Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our Ask the Expert series. Today, we are going to shine a light on two of the Foundation's pillars, research and advocacy. I'm joined today with Lynn Rogers. Lynn, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi there. So hi, everybody. My name is Lynn Rogers. I am now I'm coming up on my 3-year anniversary, woohoo, with CIDP. I was diagnosed initially as Guillain-Barre, so it's acute onset CIDP that left me paralyzed and hospitalized for 3.5 months. And then it's been the recovery and the everything else back afterwards. I also have a PhD in biomedical engineering and have worked for 20 years in the research space. So in rehabilitation research specifically, I actually have a neuroscience background. I was faculty at Northwestern University in their neuroscience program and was director of a research laboratory at the formerly Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, which is now known as the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. So I'm kind of straddling both today as a patient, current and former, as well as a scientist.
Well, Lynn, you are clearly the expert in this situation. So,
right or not, right?
We have just a couple general questions about the research process from the community that we've gathered over the years. So let's get started.
Sure.
Number one, why don't you describe the grant process to us? First of all, what is a grant? How do researchers get it? Where do they get it from? And then what becomes of it?
So a grant is an award given for a specific project or to answer a specific questions. They can have a huge breadth in terms of, you can get a grant for a travel award that is, $500 or $1,000 that will allow you to go to a particular conference, all the way up to multi-million-dollar, multi-center grants that allows multiple institutions to work together on a common project. So there can be a huge breadth of what's going on. For most scientists, what they're looking for is funding to help them answer a particular problem. And you need to get really, really specific about exactly what aspect of that problem you're trying to solve, what you're trying to look for, what disease, what aspect of that disease are you looking to understand, how that disease happens at the very beginning level? Are you looking to see how a drug impacts what's going on with that disease? Are you looking to see how different types of physical therapy might interact with a person and allow them to recover, which is more the area that I was in previously. So it can be a huge breadth of what's going on. Granting is critical for how research works. And I think that's one of the things that, unless you're in academia or you're around science quite a bit, I don't think people really understand. Like when you heard my crazy list of credentials at the beginning, right? It sounds like, okay, this person has a job at Northwestern and they have a job at this ability lab and this institute, so they're set. And those things or those places are what is paying for the research that is done. And that's actually not the case at all. Depending on what your position is, I think the largest number of researchers out there in academia are doing a combination where they do some teaching, and so they're going to get paid for teaching that piece of it for whatever classes they do, and then the 9 months of the year that they might be teaching, or through the summer if it goes the whole year. But there's also an expectation of research. And though you are getting an agreed upon salary from whoever it is you're working for, Northwestern, the Ability Lab, whoever, the expectation is that you are going to bring in the money that pays your salary, and not just your salary, but the salary of anyone else you need to work on that research. If you have graduate students, if you have postdocs, if you need a research engineer, the expectation, you're not allowed to hire those people unless you have the money to pay them, and that comes from grants. And as well as any of the money that's needed to do any laboratory tests, to pay for any equipment, right down to needing, the electrodes that you do in an EMG test that we get for looking at conduction velocities, the gel that's needed, all of those things, every last thing. The expectation is that that is being covered by the money that the researcher brings in from grants. So they are critical, and you don't move forward and you do not keep your job if you don't get those research grants to be able to support what you're doing. Certainly the institutions fill in the blanks for you. There's always going to be gaps that happen between when research grants happen, so it's not like you get booted right out the door, but that expectation is there. And so I think that's something that a lot of people probably don't understand, is how critical that is. And I think that also comes into understanding why the dollar amounts that you might hear for grants are so large, or why if you hear about a grant that might be $25,000 or $50,000, and that sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, there's no question. But what that actually covers when you're trying to pay the salaries of multiple people, and you're trying to pay MRI costs, and you're doing all of these things, it gets eaten up really, really fast. So what a grant is really what allows any research to happen, particularly in the US. That's a long answer to a short question, but that's research in a nutshell, or that's granting in a nutshell.
Yeah, so that was a great explanation, and it sparked a follow-up question in my mind. More kind of an observation. I think as I kind of came into this world and in this space, one of the things that, you know, sometimes frustrates me or frustrates people that I work with is that why is nobody just doing a grant saying, I'm going to study the cause of GBS, or I'm going to study the cause of CIDP. But, you know, as we learn more, can you talk a little bit about how really you need to form a research question or a hypothesis to get a grant?
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that and all the background work that has to go in?
Yes. Okay. So yes, so the question that you're asking and how you present that question is actually critically important. And it's an interesting thing where not only do you need to be very, very specific, it needs to be an answerable question. You know, if you've ever kind of think to, and I apologize, before we even get started, if a lot of my analogies come back to sport, that's kind of my goal. I'm also a runner and a triathlete. And so when I think about having fitness goals, or you think about having weight loss goals or anything like that, what they tell you all the time is to have a definable, achievable goal, right? Like if you say, I want to lose weight, just like you're saying, I want to cure or find the reason that GBS happens, that's kind of an amorphous thing. And there's actually, you have to break it down into the steps that get you there, which is the same way if you wanted to say, I want to lose weight and you just left it open, what most people would tell you is define a number. You know, try to get to, okay, so you know exactly what your goal is, break it down into achievable steps. How are you going to get there? What are you going to change? What are you going to do? And that's the same thing for science. To be able to answer what causes GBS, that's a big open net of a problem. And the first thing a research grant reviewer would do is look at it and say, okay, well, how are you going to do that? You know, what exactly are you looking for that will answer that question? And so that's when you need to start defining on the molecular level, maybe at that point, of exactly what proteins you're looking for, what antibodies that might be attacking the myelin, narrowing it down. There are thousands upon thousands of proteins that make up that insulation, that myelin coating on our nerves that is being chewed up, that's being attacked by our disease. Which one of those are you looking for? It's probably not scientifically plausible right now to look at all of them. So you have to narrow it down. If you don't show that you are potentially able to answer the question that you're going for with the money that's being given to you, no one's going to give it to you. So just saying, I'm going to, you know, cure cancer or find the reason for GBS, unfortunately, that is such a huge problem that it's unlikely that whatever amount of money a granting agency is giving you, you're going to be able to answer that question. They want something that's innovative. They want something that's significant. But they're also looking at what is your approach, and are you able to answer the questions that you're looking at so that you actually can show that you're moving science and understanding forward. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think it really explains why there are some researchers out there that spend their whole 30 to 50 year career on maybe one molecule because they're advancing the understanding of one piece. But at the same time, it also raises a need that we need more researchers because we need everybody to be looking at a small piece of the pie so that we can eventually put the whole puzzle together. And I just used two different analogies. So clearly I'm quite hungry, but also ready to puzzle.
Puzzles. You know, when you come together with how complicated the human body is, you know, unfortunately, you're hitting on something that's really important too. It's highly unlikely that one scientist is going to come up with the answer, right? Because you're talking about a nervous system that interacts with your muscles, that interacts with your skeletal system, that is a part of behavior, that maybe what you eat and how much you eat could play a factor. So you have all of these different things. And it's nearly impossible for one person or one doctor to be expert at all of those things. And so pulling together expertise in multiple areas is the only way that many of the problems that face us right now are going to be answered. And that's complicated, and it becomes a longer, difficult process. But working forward together allows the answer.
Absolutely. So I think the last follow-up to kind of close our grant background discussion, can you describe Whitepapers? So when a grant is completed, a lot of people are aiming to get published or aiming to get a white paper. Can you describe what that means?
Sure. So Whitepaper is kind of bread and butter. It's a publication, journal publication. So in the case of scientists that are working on funded grants from outside agencies, the expectation is that you are going to have that information that you learn from the grant, you're going to put out there in a published form. And so that publication, how well looked at that is, matters. Is it a good publication? It is thought to be crap. That matters in terms of what is thought of, and therefore maybe whether that person is able to get their next grant. They look at where you are published, how you are published. One of the things with that is that it is peer reviewed, is critical. So to show that, and what that means is you send your results, you write it up in this beautiful paper, your introduction, your results, your methods, your conclusions, what's going on, all of the different things you cite, and you send it to a journal that's particular to your area of interest. And what will then happen is if the editor thinks that it is potentially valuable, they will send it to 2 to 3 researchers that are in your field to look at and to say whether or not they believe that this is worthy of publication. They can say straight up yes or no. They can say no matter what you do to this, it's terrible. There's no way we think it belongs in this journal. Or they can offer, clarify this, we would like to see this. They can say yes, but did you do this particular experiment? And they may want to see more data. So there's an entire process that comes along with just getting that white paper published. But once it is, if it's out there, then it's been reviewed by a few experts in your field, it's put and it's published. And what starts to happen then is that it becomes part of just a piece of a puzzle that may answer a question. And so what happens there is that other scientists beyond the ones that just did your review to have you published are now looking at it, and they can start to cite you and say, this person found this piece of information, and so we're building this puzzle over here. And you're absolutely going to have people that say, yeah, no, I don't agree with the conclusions you came to. I don't think the methods brought the right data for what's happening. And there can be an entire process, and there should, and there is an entire process that goes into either validating or proving wrong what that person did. And so part of the process of science, no one thinks that a single paper or a single thing that's put out is in itself indisputable fact. You have to have that supported by a volume of information that shows the same thing, that shows that thing is true, and then also this. It becomes tricky because there's definitely the National Institute of Health here in the US, a portion of their money is definitely looking to validate the studies that are out there. So grants that are looking to validate information, but it's a tricky business because every grant is still evaluated on the idea of what's significant, what's innovative. So coming in and saying, yeah, I'm just going to do this person's experiment over here, that's not going to cut it. You're basically not going to get a grant for that. You can say that is one piece of what I want to do, is that I'm going to, we're going to replicate this and therefore use it to do X, Y, Z. Or therefore, if it does not show to be true, I've got this idea over here and we're going to do it this way. So we're always moving science forward, but it really can be an incremental process. And that's important because you have to validate. We're talking about life or death. When you're talking about pharmaceutical studies, you're talking about, is this the cure or is it not? Is this the element that can lead to the cure or is it not? You want to make sure that it's validated across the scientific community to be able to really feel solid in what you're putting out there.
Right, right. So clearly, you and I are talking about GBS-CIDP, MMN, and variance research, and we are very grateful for the NIH and the partnership that we have at the foundation with them. But it's hard to not draw parallels to what we see kind of in mainstream news today.
Yeah.
So, we know that research news typically happens in white papers and then goes through this rigorous process. And we might hear about something that's in a white paper on our cable news maybe a year or 2 years later. But given the current COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing that that's being kind of flipped on its head a little bit. And we're also seeing that the NIH is rethinking where it's putting its money. So do you want to comment? Do you have any thoughts, or, this is going to be your opinion about...
Absolutely. Everything you're hearing, by the way, unless it's just the basic nuts and bolts of things, is most definitely filtered through my opinion, good or bad. But point in that you're seeing, and when you mentioned the delay, right? The delay that comes in happens at multiple levels. So we kind of skipped a little bit, and probably just because I was talking too much about what a grant is. But on the front side, it takes a ton of time to write a grant itself. Depending on the size of the grant and the amount of information, the amount of data that you need to put in there. And sometimes it becomes kind of a catch-22 where you're saying, I need money to be able to do this project and to show this thing. And some of the grants, depending on how large they are, actually require you to show that you can do that. And they want proof that you're headed in the right direction. So you need to be able to do the experiment to get the money to do the experiment. So there's a need on the front end of getting some money for pilot data. And we can talk about that a little bit more in a bit in terms of where that can come from and what it is. But it extends the timeline between when you come up with an idea that you would like to get funded and do. It can be anywhere from 3 months to a year until you're actually submitting that grant. The process of review, it's usually about 6 months after, if we're talking about the NIH. Then 6 months after you put it in, 5 to 6, you're going to get that review back. If you're lucky, if you're in the top 11%, which is about where the funding line is right now, so 11% of grants are being funded, then on that first time through, then you might be good to go. And that money to start that grant is not going to come in again for another, X number of months. Depending on the grant, it's going to be a year, 3 years, 5 years, depending on the size of the project. And then probably another year involved in data analysis, in writing the paper, trying to get it published. So slow process, right? And so that year that you mentioned before, that process of data is finished and we're writing this paper and we're trying to get it published and then it finally comes out, that's that gap between when the experiments were actually done, when the data was actually collected, and when it's published. So right now what's happening is, because COVID-19 is such a critical problem and it's happening so fast and it's happening to so many people, that last step of peer review has been skipped in many cases. And that doesn't mean it's skipped altogether. What it means is that there is an acceptable allowance being made to get information out as fast as possible, particularly when it might be useful to doctors in the field right now. So reporters are reporting on things that are being put up, and they're saying, and you may see it all the time, it's being put out before peer review. Those articles are still going to undergo the peer review process, and they're still going to be published in a journal, but it's happening a little bit more on the back end. And that requires us to be even more critical of what we're seeing, because it hasn't had that first layer of scientists who are experts in that area look at it and say, yeah, I see the flaw right from the very beginning. And a journalist who's looking at it may not see that flaw in that methods and that something as it's being put out there. Now, it's important, and what I want to see more of is that not only do we see the media and journalists put out in this talking about these very important things and getting into the public, which they absolutely should, but as they are then discussed, reviewed, peer-reviewed, if problems with those papers, if issues come up, they need to be followed up so that the public isn't left with the impression that the first thing they read about it is fact, right? We don't know that yet. We don't know. It hasn't been validated yet. These are the things that are hoping to be true, that our expectations are true. And so that's really important. The other side of having something as vast as COVID-19 right now, in terms of, the tens of millions of people worldwide that have been affected, the 3 million plus at this point in the United States that have been affected, is that there absolutely needs to be research going on. And as a scientist and talking to other scientists, we are so impressed with what the scientific and the medical community has been able to do in well less than a year at this point. Like, it's astounding, the breakthroughs that have been able to be made. Part of why they're able to be made is that our funding agencies have mobilized to put up front. And so they'll put out things that are called RFAs, requests for applications, specific to questions related to COVID-19. And what can be interesting but difficult is then, unfortunately, there is not an unending pot of money to be able to fund every single disease and every single problem that's out there. So COVID-19 right now and COVID-19 related projects are getting a lot of money, which they need to, and they absolutely should. But for example, the National Institute of Health, the institute that autoimmune diseases follows under, is an institute called NIAID, the National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, right? So we are actually in that same heading with infectious disease, with COVID-19 related projects. And so the money that NIAID gets is being split up. But there's no question that some priority is being given right now to COVID-19 related projects. And so projects for rare disease, which always had to fight really hard to be able to get any kind of notice, are really, really crunched by what's happening. And that's where I truly believe that foundation funding becomes even more critical. So the money that the GBS-CIDP International Foundation is able to put towards research, that's going to be even more necessary to keep researchers able to continue to move forward with these questions, while other very, very important questions are also happening.
Absolutely. And this is a great segue to advocacy. So for those that don't know, I'm the Advocacy Manager at the Foundation. But as I think we've kind of described today, that there is a big umbrella that also advocacy is a big umbrella that can also cover aspects of research. So I wanted to mention a few things that at the Foundation we are completely dedicated to continuing to fund some of that pilot data, some of those longer term projects that might help people move towards getting a bigger NIH grant. We're absolutely committed to that. And we're so grateful for our Walk and Roll program, which helps to fund those grants, which is absolutely amazing. So thank you to all of our fundraisers. I also wanted to mention, you have talked about how COVID-19 is getting the attention and absolutely deserves it. But in a non-pandemic world, one of the ways to really think about getting more research is by making noise, right? So the NIH is part of a government agency that takes some direction from Congress, is funded at the bills that they pass is funded by Congress. So this is really where advocacy and research start to intersect, because what is most important is for our GBS, CIDP, MMN, other variants patients to come to Capitol Hill with us and explain to members of Congress who set the NIH budget why the NIH needs to be funded appropriately and why our institutes that fund GBS, CIDP, and variants research also need to be funded appropriately. So, this year, our in-person Hill Day obviously got a little sidetracked. We will not be doing it in person, but stay tuned as we talk more about our October month of action and how we plan to continue to raise awareness with our members of Congress, even from a distance.
And Chelsey, yeah. Quickly, along with that, we mentioned that, like, using COVID as the example, because it's so critical. That has been tagged by multiple institutions. When you tag a disease as being, this is something that this foundation is particularly interested in, then the reviewers who are members of the scientific community that are looking at those grants know that the interest, one of the questions, it's not just, is this grant significant in what it's able to find? The question being asked, whether it's a foundation or it's an institute, is this question significant and important to the goals of this institution. So what we want to do with advocacy is make sure that GBS-CIDP and variants are listed as a specific goal and a specific intention of that particular institute. And so that allows that grant, when it comes in and it's involved in that area, to be given a little extra look, to be a little extra weight in terms of, yes, this is significant. We have decided as an institute that this disease is of particular importance to us. And so when that score, which is adding together numbers put to all these things like significance and innovation and who are the investigators and what approach are they giving, all of those things are given numeric score, that can matter to that significant score because it's significant to that foundation or it's significant to that institution. So getting that stated, you know, the DoD in the last few years has listed GBS-CIDP as I'm going to call it an affliction of interest. I know that's not the right terminology, but that gives the grants a little extra bump. And the other side of it is then it's potentially attracting more scientists. Because I mentioned at the very beginning, when you're trying to make a career as a scientist, you know that the way that your career, the only way you're able to stay a scientist and continue to do work is if you continue to bring in grants. And you're not going to go into a field where no grants are available or where tiny little grants are available. To get new blood, new bodies, like I am always supremely impressed, you know, as someone that came from the world of looking at stroke and spinal cord injury and brain injury, of which unfortunately there is a very large amount of across the world and in this country. I am so impressed and amazed by the scientists that have dedicated themselves to make a career in areas that are very, very hard to get funding. The easier we make that funding to get, the more brains will be able to pull into this project. And it's not that, you know, scientists are greedy and it's not that they're uninterested. It's that literally they can't keep their jobs unless they're able to get funded for the projects that we want them to do. So we need to convince them that it's important, but we also have to show them that it's fundable. And that is critical where advocacy comes in and getting those dollars committed to the areas that we know funding is needed.
That was so well put. And I want to highlight two of our advocacy research wins. You mentioned the DoD, the peer-reviewed medical research program, and you mentioned GBS is listed as, we say, a condition eligible to be studied under that program. And that really happens because our GBS advocates, patients, write to their senators and let them know that GBS matters. And their senators then direct the DoD PRMRP, the peer-reviewed medical research program, to include GBS on that list. And that is something that we need to do every year. And we're very fortunate that we have been able to do that in the past 5 years. So that is a huge thank you to all of our advocates. And then second, the foundation is very, very fortunate to have a close relationship with the NIH. In fact, this year we did hold a virtual State of the Science meeting on GBS and a related condition called AFM. And as a result, they have put out what they call a notice of special interest for GBS. And we're very excited to continue our work with the NIH so that we can carve out, as you were saying, more of those resources for GBS, for CIDP, for variants, and continue the work that has already been started by many of our great minds, especially on our Global Medical Advisory Board. Lynn, I really think that we covered all of the major questions that I have. Do you have any final thoughts before we sign off?
I don't. I guess I would want to say to everyone that's listening that is struggling and trying to find answers with what they're doing. I know how hard it is to have a question and have there be no answer. I've been there as a scientist that, you know, every research grant practically that I have been involved in started with a conversation where somewhere along the way I said something to the effect of, you know, obviously this has been studied before, or of course, you know, this is known XYZ. And then I go and I dig into all those white papers and all that published literature and I find out, nope, sure wasn't. Can't find an answer. And there you go. Now you have what, you know, in the scientific world is often called like a gap in the literature, right? We're all looking to find what are those gaps that we as scientists can fill. What became very crystal clear to me as a patient was how difficult it is to actually live in that research gap, to be existing in that place where the answers aren't there and the therapies don't work. You know, I'm one that IVIG didn't work for. So I went through a whole relapse situation and am now on plasmapheresis, which is fantastic, but certainly weekly plasmapheresis has its own interesting takebacks and ties me to my place and, you know, all of those things. And you have these questions of why do I have to do this? Why isn't there more? What about this drug? What about that? And there's all these unknowns and it's hard. And it's hard when someone can't tell you exactly how hard should you work in physical therapy. One person may say, if you work too hard, you're going to go backwards. The other one says, you need to work as hard as we possibly can, and you're tired and you're fatigued. Know that you are not being ignored, that your questions and your concerns and your problems, there are slow answers, but there are people that are trying. And the more that we talk to them about what our problems are, about what our concerns are, about what the answers are that we need, the more that scientists are going to be able to direct that to us, and the more that advocacy is going to be able to help time money to saying, yes, these are questions that need to be answered. So please don't feel alone. Don't feel like you're struggling alone. And it does matter to make your voice heard, because you could be talking to someone that can make a difference. Somewhere along the way, it can make a difference. All of our experiences are important and unique, and they matter.
Lynn, that was so well put. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you to everybody for watching, and we will see you next time.